First of all, I'd like to welcome everybody to the first of the ceremonies for Commencement Week, where we've officially welcomed all the families and friends of the graduating class of 1987 of the Kennedy School of Government. We are aware that many of you came from very many different places, foreign countries like New York and California, and that you really, particularly the families who've been funding a lot of us, have wanted to know exactly what we've been doing over the last 12 months and in some cases 2 years. I think the answer to that is many of us aren't really sure ourselves, so if you can tell us over the course of the next week, we'll be very grateful. But the students on the Commencement Week Speakers Committee wanted to select a speaker to set the tone for Commencement Week, and the theme that we had selected as part of the Kennedy School of Government Class Marshals Committee was very much to celebrate the diversity which is apparent in the School of Government and the School of Public Policy. We were looking over the period of time that we used to select the speaker for somebody that would be able to speak to us on things such as the ethic of public service, the sorts of ideals that many of us had when we came here and hopefully still have. But the best thing about the institution, and we were talking about this earlier on today with Marion, was the sort of people that were here and the sort of commitments that people had to this school and to the ideals that the school hopefully represented. And so the Speakers Committee sat down over a long period of time to list down the kinds of people that we would look to invite in a priority order. And you'll be pleased to know, Marion, that you were top of that list, so we didn't have to go down. Although there were certain military people on the class selection committee that wanted to select Fawn Hall, but they weren't too sure that she could type, and anyway we knew that she'd be otherwise engaged this week. Those of you who were present at Marion Wright Edelman's speech this afternoon would be aware of the sort of commitment and enthusiasm and energy, and I guess more than that, the political savvy and the appreciation of the reality of the political process that she demonstrated today. I would like to read to you, by way of background, some of her curriculum vitae or history, but I think that's only part of the story, but let me start with that. Marion Wright Edelman is currently the head of the Children's Defence Fund, which is a Washington research and legal advocacy organisation which she founded in 1973, and which I might interpolate, she has insisted never received a single cent of government monies. The Children's Defence Fund is a leader in defending and expanding the rights of children through congressional lobbying, scholarly research and legal advocacy. Marion was born in South Carolina and holds degrees from Spelman College and Yale Law School, and from Yale she went back to the South to really fight segregation, poverty and hunger. She started the Legal Defence Fund office in Jackson, Mississippi, and became the first black woman admitted to the Mississippi Bar, which was some achievement, particularly in those times. She then moved to Washington and was the congressional liaison for the 1968 Poor People's Campaign, sponsored by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, then formed the Washington Research Project, which focused on the needs and concerns of poor people. In 1973, she transformed that project into the Children's Defence Fund in response to the overwhelming effects of poverty and racial discrimination on youth. She has written a number of books which I'm told are very interesting, and certainly when I started to read them in preparation for this, I found that they were increasingly the case. The latest book is entitled Families in Peril, The Agenda for Social Change, and particularly chapters of that for those of you who were there at this afternoon's comments on the issue of teenage pregnancy and the way it affects not just black Hispanic children but the whole of the American community is a very interesting project indeed. We selected you, Marion, for the kind of reasons that we outlined to you today and which you related in your speech this afternoon, and we look forward to your comments on the concept of public service to this graduating class. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Marion Wright Edelman.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm delighted I'm delighted to be here and to share this wonderful occasion with what I know is the single best graduating class that the Kennedy School has ever had. I'm going to be a bit long, so I warn you in advance, and I may also be a bit blunt. But I am pleased to have this chance to talk about public service and the ethic of public service with you tonight. Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem, our president said in his first inaugural address in 1980. The quality of ethics in government is often intricately bound up with the office holder's view of whether government is ultimately a force for good in the society or a force for evil. One reason we have seen such a high level of unethical behavior in the current administration is the dominance of people who think of government as a presumptively illegitimate enterprise, while any private activity is presumptively valid. If the public purposes of one's jobs are not considered a high calling, then the restraints against unethical behavior quickly erode. Most of you who are Kennedy School graduates plan, I hope, a career in government. You have implicitly or explicitly decided that government can be a force for good. But I will be presumptuous and suggest that many of you also harbor lingering doubts about that conclusion, doubts created and reinforced by the loud and constant drumbeat of attacks directed at government in our society, especially during the last 20 years. There is some paradox in this drumbeat, to say the least, since many of the loudest drumbeaters are government officials. For example, there is a federal judge in Chicago named Frank McGarr, who coined what he calls McGarr's Law. It says that whatever government does, it does badly. This is hardly a novel law, but one wonders at the outset whether Judge McGarr includes judging within the ambit of things that government does badly. And if so, how he reconciles his law with his deduction of that law during his experience carrying out a government function. We would call this McGarr's paradox. Judging disputes between citizens is, of course, one of the oldest and most fundamental government roles. The extent to which it is done well or badly depends on the people selected to do it and the rules of judging that the society uses, not on the fact that it is a public function. A better rule would be that, at least in a democratic society, what government does well or does badly generally reflects what a society and its members do well or do badly, whether in public or in private life. Was the Challenger tragedy the fault of the Morton Thiokol Company or of NASA? Are the cost overruns and malfunctions of major defense systems the fault of the Pentagon or of major defense contractors? The public may identify these as failed government programs, but obviously they failed in major part because of private performance and are really reflections of broader social failures in the defense case, or perhaps simply the vicissitudes or imperfections of all human efforts in the Challenger case. One could point as well to joint public-private efforts that have been extraordinarily successful. Medicaid's passage in 1965 gave poor people access to a predominantly private health delivery system through public insurance payments. In the 15 years after Medicaid began, black infant mortality in this country dropped 49%, more than 9 times the rates of improvements during the prior 15-year period, and I've apologized to not a single person in the last 10 years in trying to expand Medicaid to include far more poor mothers and children, and it is our intent to get it up to 200% of the poverty level. The right wing's Manichaean view of government versus private efforts leads to absurd results and virtual self-parody. A few months after the Air Florida plane crashed in the Potomac in 1982, Harper's Magazine ran an article on President Reagan's attitude to government. The piece was accompanied by 2 pitches, and I'm describing Harper's view, a parody of this. One was of Lenny Skutnik, who jumped into the river to help save survivors and was honored by the president for this brave act. Mr. Scutney's picture bore the caption in Harper's Commendable Private Initiative, or something to that effect. The other picture was of the Park Service helicopter plucking survivors from the water. It bore the caption, Burdensome Government Intervention. The idea that the government reflects the society and is not some separate entity with radically different qualities borders on being a truism. But it is a truism we seem to have forgotten. This forgetfulness is exacerbated by an American mythology that prizes independence and fantasizes absolute self-sufficiency as the only correct way of life. Throughout our history, we have given government help to our people and then forgotten the fact when it came time to celebrate our people's accomplishments. 200 years ago, Congress granted federal lands to states to help maintain public schools. 105 years ago, President Lincoln signed the Morrill Act, granting land for colleges. The first food voucher and energy assistance programs came not during the New Deal or the War on Poverty, I hope the press will notice, but after the Civil War, when Congress and President Lincoln created the Freedmen's Bureau. Federal help for vaccinations, vocational education, and maternal health began not with Kennedy, Johnson, and Carter, but under Madison, Wilson, and Harding, respectively. Our parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents benefited from this government help, and obviously we currently benefit from it. Only the blindest economists could doubt that American prosperity is built on the synergistic relations between government and private initiative. But it is some of the blindest economists and political scientists and moral philosophers, in quotes, who have the ear of many of our leaders or themselves now political leaders. Once born in Fort Benning, Georgia in 1942, where his father was living on a federal veterans disability pension. He attended the University of Georgia, a public university, where his tuition and expenses were paid for by the Federal War Orphans Act. He had planned to go into physics, but learning that physics postdoctoral fellows got low pay, he did graduate work in economics, paid for by a Federal National Defense Education Act fellowship. He started his career teaching in Texas at Texas A&M, a federal land-grant college. Today, he is United States Senator Phil Gramm, a conservative who seeks to do away with most federal domestic programs. In 1981, he was one of the prime authors of the law that decimated virtually every federal program for low-income children, a law referred to as Gramm Ladder. And he is one of the prime authors of the Gramm-Rudman-Hollins Balanced Budget Amendment, which threatens to wreak even greater havoc on some federal programs for needy children and families. Senator Gramm seems to suffer from the peculiarly American amnesia or hypocrisy that wants us to think that families must be wholly self-sufficient, that makes us forget how government helps all of us, regardless of class, and that makes us believe that the government is simply wasting its billions through incompetence and by supporting a wholly dependent, self-perpetuating class of poor people while doing nothing but taxing the rest of us. Government is certainly no more faultless than the rest of us, but it is not inherently bad or incompetent. Government is a means of formulating and acting on common social goals, organizing a society, and regulating human behavior. The extremists on the right, however, despise government because they generally do not believe in having communal goals for any institution to pursue at a national or regional or state level. Aside from national security and stopping some violent crime, often only that which occurs outside the home, the radical right has few, if any, aspirations for us as a society. It is not merely uninterested in alleviating the poverty that kills the hopes and dreams of millions of children. It ultimately challenges all communal activity other than that which occurs through voluntary institutions at the local level. It challenges Social Security as well as public schools, Medicare as well as subsidized child care, the FCC as well as the antitrust law, state and local as well as national regulation. It posits virtual anarchy as the remedy for flaws of governance. It glories in tearing down and runs from building constructive responses to the growing human needs of the young and the old, the homeless and the ignorant. If the only principle our society adheres to is the invisible hand, it leaves little or no room for the hand of man or the hand of God, whom Micah the prophet has told us what he wants: to be fair and just and merciful and to work humbly with our God. There is then a purposelessness, a hollowness left at the core of the society. If members of a society have no common purpose, nothing to believe in except greed, no mutual goals, no joint vision, no shared expectations, nothing again except greed and aggrandizement for themselves tends to flow, there is no glue or moral purpose which holds our society together. If the society has no overarching goal and much of the government has no purpose other than its own destruction, then high office holders passing through government have insufficient incentives to act ethically. We see the results in deteriorating ethics in public life, but we see the results in private life as well. For the destruction of the communal ethos makes greed paramount. For every Ed Meese, there is an Ivan Boesky. For every Michael Deaver, there is a Reverend Jim Baker and his Tammy. For every traveler's check cashed by Ollie North, there are 1,000 checks kited by E.F. Hutton. The distinction between unethical behavior in the public and private realms breaks down. Indeed, we need a full-fledged congressional investigation just to figure out if the greed of Richard Secord is public or private sector greed. The ethical vacuum of our times is perhaps seen at the extreme in the number of Americans who have been discovered selling military secrets to the Soviet Union. And the decline in ethics leads not merely to financial venality, but makes truth a devalued commodity. One need only look to the congressional testimony of an Elliott Abrams to know that we no longer require truth-telling as a precondition for holding high government office. And we wonder why so many of our children flounder as they shadow our steps. But the hollowness at the core of a purposeless society makes more than government a casualty. Our young are casualties too. They are casualties in the sense that only a society with an eroded ethical base would allow more than a fifth of its children to live in abject poverty in the midst of the greatest affluence the world has ever known. In rich America, poverty kills at least 10,000 of our children every year, 1 every 53 minutes. Something is out of kilter when just 400,000 Americans own over $1 trillion among them, and it would take less than $50 billion to wipe out poverty among all 33 million poor Americans. While our nation maintains its leading status as the world's arms peddler, it has slipped from 6th to last place, to a tie for last place, among 20 industrialized nations in keeping our babies alive in the first year of life. A black baby born in the nation's capital has less chance of living to the first year of life than a baby born in Trinidad and Tobago or Costa Rica. How does an American child die of poverty, I'm sometimes asked. Let me share 2 brief examples and ask whether it is sufficient to say that parents alone ought to do better, or whether the rest of us also have some responsibility. Linda Grant had 2 small children, Anthony 3 and Maurice 4. They lived in Dade County, Florida. The 2 children died in an accident that could have been averted had the family had access to child care help. Although Mrs. Grant worked to support her family, their income was so low that she could not afford to pay for child care. Because she qualified for government help, she put her children on Florida's waiting list for child care assistance, a list which then included 22,000 other names. While she waited for help, she relied on friends and relatives to care for the children, as many thousands of parents do every day. But some days these arrangements fell through, and the boys were left alone. On November 6, 1986, Maurice and Anthony climbed into the clothes dryer, closed the door, and tumbled and burned to death. The Miami Herald wrote, there are hundreds, maybe thousands more tragedies waiting to happen in Dade County alone. In every home where young children are left to fend for themselves. They're not latchkey kids, they are lock-up kids locked inside for the day by parents who can't afford daycare, can't afford not to work, and can't get government assistance. Baby C was born prematurely with lung disease. His parents lived in a car and lacked health insurance. His mother received no prenatal care and inadequate nutrition. The family lived on handouts from neighbors and hospital staff. By the time baby C died at 7 months of age, after a struggle to keep him alive in extraordinarily expensive neonatal intensive care nurseries, again, if you don't want to help kids, you ought to help the taxpayer's burden. It costs about $600 to provide a mother with comprehensive prenatal care. It costs about $1,000 a day to keep a sick baby alive in an intensive neonatal intensive care nursery, which is what happened with baby C. But by the time that baby died, after months in the hospital, the mother was pregnant again with baby D, who was delivered stillborn in the car 5 days after baby C's death. The state of Michigan paid for a double funeral. Our nation's shameful infant mortality rate is only one symptom of a broader national catastrophe that is in the making. Although the survival and quality of our children, youth, and families are the single most important determinants of the quality of the national future, of the 4- and 5-year-olds in today's America who are the potential students and workers in the year 2000, 1 in 4 is poor, 1 in 5 is at risk of becoming a teen parent, 1 in 6 has no health insurance, 1 in 6 is also living in a family where no parent has a job. 1 in 7 is at risk of dropping out of school. 1 in 2 has a mother in the workforce, but only a small minority have quality, affordable child care. No moral or sensible nation can dare write off such a significant portion of its human assets. To ignore these facts is to jeopardize our nation's future and undermine the competitiveness and productivity of our economy in the 21st century. Young people between 16 and 24 years of age will constitute only 16% of the U.S. population by 1995. 1 in 3 of these potential workers will be a minority. As the number of young workers steadily declines, business and industry and the military will have to depend upon the skills and productivity of potential workers and soldiers who are today disproportionately poor, minority, undereducated, and untrained, and in whom we have traditionally failed to invest. This human development deficit is a major piece of the urban and rural crisis you'll have to face and help find solutions for those of you who are going to go back into public service. A principal challenge of the next American decade, within and without government, is the protection of our children from death by arms, want, and neglect. The nation must mount a carefully conceived, comprehensive human investment effort in all of our young and in all of our families in order to prevent and alleviate the debilitating effects of decades of poverty, racial discrimination, neglect, and eroding employment and family wage base, and budget and tax thefts from the weak by the military and wealthy. We must begin with a national commitment to ensure that every child has basic health, nutrition, and early childhood services, and thus the capacity and opportunity to develop strong basic skills. But the level of a young person's basic skills, academic skills, has a powerful effect on his or her prospects for future achievement, teenage parenthood, welfare dependency, employment, and eventual self-sufficiency. Youths who by 18 have the weakest reading and math skills compared with those with above average skills are 8 times more likely to have children out of wedlock, 7 times more likely to drop out of school before graduation, and are 4 times more likely to be both out of work and on welfare. Nearly half of all poor youths have reading and math skills which place them in the bottom 5th of the basic skills distribution, and more than 3/4 of all poor youths have below average basic skills. And when we look at the combination of poverty and weak basic skills, we see that it accounts for virtually all of the racial disparities in teen childbearing rates. Young women 16 to 19 with below average basic skills who live in poor families, whether white, black, or Hispanic, are 6 times more likely to have children than young women with above average basic skills living in non-poor households. If we are serious as a nation about preventing teenage pregnancy, infant mortality, welfare dependency, unemployment, enhancing national competitiveness, we must invest now in upgrading the basic skills of all of our children, and it must be a continuum of supports, working with families and a range of community institutions that begins at birth. And by calling for more effective and sustained governmental action, I am not negating the importance of these parental and community supports. We've got to begin to find a way to help the media and more politicians hold more than one idea or strategy in their heads at the same time. Otherwise, we're going to have a very hard time solving complex social problems, which are like a seamless web, which require multifaceted interventions and strategies sustained over time. Not just poor children are casualties, however, of our loss of moral bearings. All of our children are casualties, regardless of class, because of the despair and driftlessness that a hollow society promotes. The poor black youths who hang out on street corners and the rich white youths who abuse drugs are all victims. We see despair in the teen suicide rates, in the out-of-wedlock birth rates, which are rising among whites, in anorexia, in cocaine usage, in the joining of cults, and the fatalism or amorality that preys on so many of our own young people. I don't know if any of you have read Less Than Zero, a recent novel about the teenage children of the super rich in Los Angeles. It portrays vividly, indeed horrifyingly, the wasted lives that I am suggesting. John Levy of the Jung Institute says that many American children of privilege are afflicted by affluenza, with symptoms of boredom, guilt, low self-esteem, and a lack of motivation. In some ways, he and other psychiatrists and psychologists say the children of the urban rich most resemble the children of the urban poor. Both groups frequently suffer from broken homes and absentee parents, often develop hard streetwise skills to belie gaping emotional holes and move amid easily accessible alcohol, drugs, and sex. A healthy society has common goals that tie its people together and give its youth a sense that they are engaged in enterprises that lend meaning to life, that tells children they live in a purposeful social, ethical, and historical context. There are many possible causes to tie a society together: demolishing slums, or dealing with the drying up supply of housing for low-income and middle-income families, abolishing child poverty and homelessness, eliminating racism, strengthening the family, rebuilding the cities, combating AIDS, and bolstering public health, attaining full employment for the millions who want to work and can't find work, or who are unskilled and unqualified for the changing jobs in our economy, giving youth hope, caring for the elderly, whipping inflation now, stopping the arms race, achieving peace in the Middle East, creating equal opportunity or fighting sexism, abolishing world hunger. The list can go on, obviously. But I suggest that you cannot name a single overarching domestic goal or peace-related foreign goal for which our society and government stand today with any sense of common purpose and determination. In the absence of such national purpose, there should be no surprise that many public officials, including many young ones, are morally adrift. They see their peers from college or law school or business school or even from this school pursuing only money and status, and in the absence of a substitute purpose to pursue, begin to wonder why they too should seek only those goals. A BMW with a vanity license plate may be a shallow goal, but our society today offers too few substitutes for our youth unless they have extraordinary inner direction. This is the real meaning of the Reagan era, in my view. But I submit that that era is rapidly ending, and I'm going to end on up notes, if there's any chance. and that a society with any sense of self-preservation will not indefinitely tolerate the kind of hollowness that's infecting our core, that any great nation must have great undertakings, and I believe very deeply that we have the potential to be a very great nation. The sparks of commitment occurring on our campuses about American complicity in South Africa, the growing concern for the poor, the emerging, if not focused, peace movement, are all manifestation of a need for meaningful social goals. They also reflect a growing recognition expressed well by former Harvard Law professor Louis Sohn that the future belongs not to those who have the largest numbers of weapons of mass destruction, but to those who can best solve their own economic and social problems and can provide a beacon of hope for the rest of humanity, that all nations' problems can be similarly solved. I can't predict the particular shape of the enterprises our nation will undertake in the coming cycle of communal enterprise. I am convinced the country is post-Reagan. The pendulum is beginning to swing back in our direction. I am determined, however, that part of it will be a renewed commitment to the needs of our poor and our children. It would take a wiser and perhaps more foolhardy woman than me to prophesy the details, though we are working hard as one group in one area to get our policy menus and community networks ready to seize and seed greater national responsiveness to poor children and to preventive investment in families. I think it's going to be an exciting time for you to become and remain public servants, that our nation and our federal and state and local governments will be embarking on enterprises that will give your careers meaning and fulfillment, and that the resurgence of public life will demand of you the best that you can give with the highest ethical standards. As you depart for government service at all levels or for agencies that influence government and public policies, I hope you will struggle to develop some larger vision within which to view your role and task. I hope you will view your job as a mission rather than just as a career. I hope you will set criteria for accomplishment that go beyond your next promotion. I hope you will regularly ask yourselves, will I leave something behind that is more just, more efficient, and more responsive to citizen needs than I found it? Have I contributed to enhanced opportunity for the weak and not just for the strong? Have I fostered policies that include rather than exclude? I hope you will not be afraid to risk failing for things that matter, and understand that good service is not synonymous with winning all the time, but is the rent each of us pays for living on the earth in whatever role and way we choose. Now, I'm sure you have learned everything there is to know about how to be effective in whatever government or private sector careers you choose from this Kennedy School. And at the risk of redundancy, I want to share a few of the important lessons, or more accurately, make a few pleas that come out of my 25 years of public service work. I can't believe it's been that long. On behalf of the poor, minorities, and children, groups whose well-being is my life's passion. I wish for you, above all, a passion of some kind in your life, to keep you going in good times and bad, because you're going to find that money and jockeying for status and parties and awards and political game playing hold poorly as long-haul life anchors. The first lesson or plea is for you to try to see problems whole, yet know how to break them down into manageable pieces for action. And I think that a part of that is what you should have gotten out of the Kennedy School. Stick with each piece, though, until it is solved, and then move systematically on to the next piece until the whole is positively affected. Too many of us in and out of government are too lazy to engage in the hard and unglamorous work that is the grist of lasting change. We grab onto simple fixes for only partially defined problems that often do more harm than good, and leave both public and victims cynical about the change process and government. Teenage pregnancy afflicts white, black, and Hispanic, middle class, and poor, urban and rural teens, but for different reasons, with different consequences requiring different outreach policy, family, and community remedies adapted to all the different racial, cultural, age, and gender groups, and they must include boys as well as girls. Very important to keep breaking problems down, disaggregating it, and putting it back together again so that you can see the whole puzzle. And please pay attention to the nitty-gritty steps of implementation. Passing a law or drafting a regulation or issuing an RFP is the easiest part, usually the easiest part of the change process. Making it work, informing the public and assisting in monitoring local official enforcement, protecting budgets in a sustained manner, and getting and training sensitive and skilled personnel to administer it in a compassionate way are all important parts of the change process. The second plea is to keep your eye on the goal and purpose of the laws you are enforcing. Regardless of changing politicians at the top, hold yourself accountable as one individual for being fair, honest, and professional. Too often, simply doing your job with integrity today is labeled courageous. While it is important to learn how to play the political game to get decent policies adopted, it is equally important to recognize that good politics and good policies may not always be the same. Try hard not to confuse style with substance, means with end. You are the means to good ends. You are not the end itself. Quite junior staff often can have a disproportionate effect, though, on the quality of governmental action. In important but subtle ways, many have kept our nation's response to the needs of its people alive and adaptive, even when the machinery of high government policy is locked up in one of its recurrent, sullen political seizures. Two brief examples from CDF work illustrate this fact, and we're always looking for more decent gnomes within the agencies. The first report we did was on Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, now called Chapter 1. It was written from the files of the HEW Audit Agency reports. They were not exciting reports. In fact, they were extremely dull, but they were honest, thorough, and precise. They did more to improve the educational outcomes for poor children than all the expensive evaluation contracts put together. The audit reports were effective because they started with the question of what the schools intended to do with the money, whether they intended to raise reading scores of poor, low-achieving children or something entirely else. Unfortunately, in those days, and too often in these days, it was too often something entirely else. The second example came in one of the Reagan administration's early budgets in an OMB footnote to a proposed consolidation in a program I'll keep confidential to protect the helpful official. The footnote made clear in the driest bureaucratic language that an important program for poor children would die if the Reagan administration's consolidation proposal prevailed. Although the published document did not contain the footnote, it stayed on the draft just long enough for the news to leak to us and to the Hill. The consolidation was rejected. Don't just dream about grandiose acts of doing good. Every day do small ones that add up over time to positive patterns, which give people a sense of confidence in government as a help rather than a hindrance. So often we get bogged down in our own ego needs and lose sight of the broader goal. T.S. Eliot in his poem, The Cocktail Party, once said that half the harm that is done in this world is done by people who want to feel important. Now, there's nothing wrong with feeling important, but not at the cost of doing important duties for the people you are there and intending to serve. Have a can-do attitude, and don't hide behind the endless bureaucratic excuses for doing nothing about pressing human needs. Be quietly courageous. Goethe said, possessions lost, nothing lost. Principles lost, something lost. Courage lost, everything lost. The third plea is for you to know the limits of technocratic tools and never forget the human factor in any policy analysis and remedy development. Robert Kennedy reminded us that the gross national product, while important, and I quote him, does not include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It allows neither for the justice in our courts nor for the justness of our dealings with one another. The gross national product measures neither wit nor courage, our wisdom or our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. Careful homework, facts and figures and quantitative analysis are important but only partial tools in being an effective government servant or anything else. You must also have human common sense and the ability to see and hear and understand people, all of whom you are there to serve well. And you got to be alive to people of all kinds, to listen to people of all kinds. You need to learn how to understand and be comfortable with blacks and Hispanics and Orientals and Native Americans and poor folk in Appalachia, if your policy is intended to work for them or in fact going to work. You need to make sure that you try to get out of your offices, because we become so self-important in Washington and in state capitals, and visit real people from time to time to ward off this self-importance that afflicts so many of us so often if we get bogged down in our paperwork. And again, obviously, I think you've had a good session or a good debate that's emerging here at the Kennedy School is a way of making you comfortable with people in your jobs who are going to be the principal targets of what we're going to have to relate to in our society. The Kennedy School is going to have to reflect that in its own life. You can't be trained well if you are going out into the world never having dealt with a variety of people here in your own midst. And please remember that you are not exempt from responsibility for the moral outcomes of your judgments or your associations. You probably could present data showing an economic advantage from slavery for somebody, but that does not end the inquiry. You're not hired guns. Why hungry children should be fed should not entail endless debates and commissions in a decent society, or endless debates about whether government has a proper role in seeing that children's basic survival needs are met. Fourth plea is to persist and to resist either or single strategy approaches to complex social problems. I've already talked about that. Although there are no quick, simple, cheap, or easy answers to many of the moral, social, and economic problems facing our nation, they are solvable, I'm convinced. There are a number of steps each of us can take so that many can be solved or significantly alleviated, and I think those of you who are going to go in government will have an extraordinary opportunity to have an impact on these social problems in the future. Lastly, I just hope you will have faith in yourselves, in your nation, in your fellow human beings, in your government's ability to make a positive difference in the life of your community. Those of you who hear me often hear me talking about Sojourner Truth, who was my role model, who was an illiterate slave woman, and she still is the model for how I think we together as a people will begin to address pressing social needs. She was an illiterate slave woman, but she had an unerring opposition to slavery and to second-class treatment of women, and she never gave up an opportunity to speak out against these back at a time when nobody wanted to listen to her, and there are going to be a whole lot of times when nobody wants to listen to you either, but you just keep biting away at it all in your own quiet and effective way. And my favorite Sojourner story came one day, which I tell a lot, when she was speaking out against slavery, and an old white man stood up in the audience and heckled her and said he didn't care any more about what she was talking about than an old flea bite. And she snapped right back at him and said, "That's all right, the Lord willing, I'm going to keep you scratching." At a time when so many of us want to be good dogs, I would suggest, big dogs, I would suggest that we ought to all think, and particularly those who will be working in bureaucratic situations, think about just being a good flea. Enough fleas biting strategically can make even the biggest dog uncomfortable. And if you do that on a sustained basis, and if we, over the course of the years, and I've been watching the Flea Corps for Poor Children grow over the last 10 years, if you do that, see yourselves as a flea for justice within whatever bureaucracy or agency you are. And if you try to keep a vision of a warless world, however unrealistic that seems to be, and a vision of city streets as playgrounds for children, and keep biting in the little day-to-day ways to see how you can move toward that vision can become reality. From determined wills, from careful work, from purposeful and unselfish work, from systematic and sustained work. I look forward with you to transforming the vision our nation has for itself. I think the big debates for the next election are not about the trade deficit or the budget deficit. It's really about our mission in a world plagued by hunger. And is our mission going to be the humanization of the world, of the earth, which saps the lives of children every few seconds from hunger and malnutrition, which are preventable? Or is it going to be the militarization of the stars? I think the fundamental debate has to be about who we are as a people, what direction we're going to go, and whether we can be a beacon of hope and light for the rest of the world, that social and economic problems can be solved, and what a challenge you face in trying to begin to bring this vision into reality in government. Good luck, and God bless you.
Marion, that was tremendous. Marion's agreed to take questions from anybody here tonight. She did agree beforehand. I'm sure she will agree now. So we have the usual procedure here at Forum Speeches. There are this time only 3 microphones in the audience, and we'd ask you to come to the microphone closest to you if you'd like to ask a question. I'd remind you that this speech is being recorded for transmission at a later date, so if you could give your name and direct your question, please. I think you've really floored everybody, Mary. Perhaps while you're thinking of some questions, I'd like to make 2 public announcements. Firstly, in answer to Frank Caneen, that there will be somebody here on Thursday morning to let you know how to put those wretched and cursed robes and hoods on straight. And the second one is more seriously to let you all know that everybody here is welcome to a coffee function put on by the Black Students' Caucus in the penthouse immediately following the closure of the speech. Marion, I think it's more than that. Marion, I think this is probably an indication that this is one of those speeches that's left everybody very enthusiastic for you, and that they'd like to meet with you on a personal basis in the penthouse at a later stage. I know that's certainly my own feeling, and on a one-to-one basis anyway. But I think if there are no questions, I'll go on to close on behalf of the student body here, Marion. We are all at this stage in this last week going through the throes of packing up and moving out. One of the things you said in this afternoon's address recorded very well with me, which was the statement that cultural signals are the things that you remember after everything that you were taught at college has been forgotten. And the other test was the test that the American Postal Service has implemented for determining the validity of what you learned at Harvard University, and that is $1.15 charge per pound of printed matter that one sends home. And for those of us that have just shredded everything bar one very small box, I'd like to indicate that as far as I'm concerned, and I know many of you here, that certainly your speech tonight was something that doesn't fit into the category of printed lecture notes, but is certainly part of the ideals that I hope we will all have and the memories we have of the time here at the Kennedy School. It was a very good year, particularly for those of us who are from overseas, to be not only at the Harvard community, but also in the Kennedy School and in America generally. There was the crisis that this country went through with the Iran scam affair and everything that went on, and the news that emanated from Washington, with all your cautions about taking Washington too seriously on one side. There was also the symbolism and the triumphal symbolism of the Harvard 350th celebrations, which made me personally wonder what kind of educational institution this was and what it stood for. And I think it was very much a triumphal institution, an institution rejoicing in the fact of what it stood for and what it had and the history that it stood for over the time. But the thing that registered most with me was the very simple ceremony that took place on Friday the 29th on the President's 70th birthday, President Kennedy's, what would have been his 70th birthday. And just walking around on my own in the Kennedy Park afterwards and looking at the statements in relation to concepts of public service and what this country and the ideals of America stands for and has stood for over the test of time, and is certainly something that has registered very strongly with me for my time here, and I know most of the foreign students to whom I've spoken. So, Marion, it's been part of the inspiration that I certainly have had here, and many of us have had, to have you with us tonight. The inspirational desiderata, which I suppose is one way of classifying your speech, has been something for us all, and I'd ask you all to join with me in welcoming Marion's ideas into our future as we leave here. And now with that, we'd like you to join us all for coffee upstairs in the penthouse.